There are roughly 200 dead bodies still on the slopes of Mount Everest right now, and most of them didn't die from falling. They died from the inside out, sitting down to rest and never getting back up. And the terrifying thing is, their brains told them everything was fine. Above 8,000 meters, the atmospheric pressure drops so dramatically that there simply isn't enough oxygen to sustain human life for any extended period of time. That's the death zone. And this video is going to walk you through exactly what it does to the human body and brain, because the reality is a lot stranger and a lot more disturbing than you run out of air and die. We're talking about your brain swelling, your body eating itself, and climbers holding full conversations with people who don't exist. One of those things actually saved a man's life. I'll get to that. But first, there's something even more fundamental about the death zone that almost nobody talks about, and it completely changes how you understand everything else. Save that thought because we're coming back to it at the end. Let's start with what's actually happening the moment you cross that 8,000-meter line. Above 8,000 meters, there is so little oxygen that the body starts to die minute by minute and cell by cell. At sea level, the air is about 21% oxygen. Up in the death zone, barometric pressure falls to around 356 millibars, less than one-third of what it is at sea level. So your lungs are pulling in air, but the pressure behind each breath is so low that your blood can barely grab onto the oxygen molecules. Your hemoglobin, the stuff in your red blood cells that carries oxygen around your body, starts coming up nearly empty, and the organ that screams the loudest when that happens is your brain. Here's where it gets genuinely alarming. Most people picture oxygen deprivation as your brain just going dim, like a light slowly fading. But the real process is more violent than that. Environmental hypoxia poses a significant risk of dysfunctioning and damaging the neurocognitive system, and inadequate oxygenation can lead to both acute and chronic brain damage. And the brain doesn't just sit there and take it, it fights back, and that fight is part of what kills you. Within about 30 to 60 minutes of entering the death zone, your brain triggers cerebral vasodilation. Basically, it forces your blood vessels to widen and flood the brain with more blood to compensate for the lack of oxygen. More blood sounds like a good thing. It isn't. That surge raises intracranial pressure, and suddenly you've got a brain that's swelling inside a rigid skull. That's what produces the crushing headaches, the loss of coordination, the visual disturbances. When the brain doesn't get enough oxygen, it leads to dizziness, confusion, and poor decision-making. And this can cause climbers to act irrationally, like taking off their necessary equipment. The brain is essentially trying to save itself and accidentally making things worse. Now here's the part that expedition psychologists have actually given a name to. Decision-making ability deteriorates dramatically. Climbers ignore obvious danger signs, fail to recognize teammates in distress, or make fatal choices like continuing upward past their turnaround times. The death zone strips away the higher cognitive functions that keep us alive, leaving only primitive survival instincts. And here's the cruel irony. The cognitive collapse is so thorough that you don't know it's happening. Many climbers who die push past safe turnaround times, convinced they can just make it. The brain that's supposed to protect you is the one signing your death warrant, and while that's going on in your head, your body is doing something equally brutal below the neck. In the death zone, climbers' brains and lungs are starved for oxygen, their risk of heart attack and stroke is increased, and their judgment quickly becomes impaired. The heart beats rapidly to compensate for the lack of oxygen, often exceeding 140 beats per minute, which puts a strain on the heart and increases the chance of a heart attack or stroke. And your body, running out of fuel, starts making a decision you really don't want it to make. It starts eating your muscle tissue for energy. Elite climbers lose 1 to 2% of their body weight every single day in the death zone as muscle breaks down, which is why even experienced climbers who've summited before face identical risk each time they go back. The mountain doesn't care about your resume. The lungs get hit too, and this one is almost hard to believe. High-altitude pulmonary edema, fluid building up in the lungs, produces a cough so persistent and so violent that it can actually crack ribs. You can literally break your own bones coughing, and the fluid that comes up is white, watery, and frothy, which is your body essentially drowning from the inside. So we've got a swelling brain, a failing heart, disintegrating muscles, and cracking ribs. And here's where I want to come back to that open question I planted earlier, because this next part is where the death zone stops being just a physical story and becomes something much weirder. Be honest, if someone told you that more than half of climbers who experience high-altitude psychosis hallucinate a specific consistent companion, you'd probably assume that's just random noise from a brain misfiring. But it isn't random at all. Studies on high-altitude climbers have linked these experiences to hypoxic conditions, where oxygen deprivation heightens temporal lobe sensitivity, and felt presences were the predominant hallucination in 54% of episodes. This is called the third man factor, and it is one of the most documented and least explained phenomena in extreme altitude medicine. When mountaineer Jeremy Windsor was climbing Everest in 2008, alone at 27,000 feet, he encountered another man, named Jimmy, who offered words of encouragement and trekked alongside him before disappearing without a trace into the snow and ice. Windsor was a doctor. He knew exactly what was happening to him physiologically, and it didn't matter. The companion felt completely real. Neurological research suggests the third man factor may arise from stress-induced electrical activity in the temporoparietal junction, the same region involved in temporal lobe epilepsy, which produces a hallucinatory sensation of presence, often providing guidance or comfort. This disrupts the brain's representation of body position and self-other boundaries, projecting internal sensations externally as a companion. In other words, your brain invents a friend, and that friend is actually you, just the part of you that's still trying to survive. In 1933, British mountaineer Frank Smythe was attempting Everest from Camp 6 at around 27,600 feet without supplemental oxygen. After his climbing partner turned back due to illness, Smythe pressed on alone into severe fatigue and hypoxia, and felt the vivid presence of an invisible companion so strongly that he paused to break off a piece of his rations and offered half to the unseen figure before realizing no one else was there. Many of the mountaineers who have experienced the third-person phenomenon at extreme altitude agree that this intensely vivid perception has helped them survive in challenging situations. Research has found that these hallucinations are more mysterious than scientists previously thought, since they cannot be fully explained as a side effect of altitude sickness or brain swelling alone. The brain, even while it's failing, is improvising ways to keep you moving. Now, if you're still watching, and I really hope you are because this last part is the one that flips everything, here's the thing about the death zone that the researchers at the High Altitude Pathology Institute in Bolivia have been arguing for years. The whole concept of a death zone may be built on a flawed assumption. Because here's a human being who spends months in oxygen levels equivalent to the summit of Everest, every single day with no supplemental oxygen, no acclimatization protocol, and no cognitive impairment whatsoever. That human being is an unborn baby. Fetuses in utero experience partial oxygen pressure levels comparable to those at the Everest summit, and they develop normally. The death zone isn't universally lethal. It's lethal for an adult body that was never built for it. And that brings us to the Sherpas, because they are the living proof of what happens when a human population spends thousands of years adapting to exactly this environment. Genetic evidence from Sherpas supports observations that natural selection acting on the EPAS1 gene has contributed to high-altitude adaptation. Natural selection on the EPAS1 gene occurred in the Tibetan population over millennia of occupation on the Tibetan Plateau, and these variations may regulate physiological responses to high-altitude hypoxia via a hypoxia-inducible transcription factor pathway. What that means in plain English is that Sherpas aren't just better acclimatized. Their cells respond to low oxygen in a fundamentally different way at the genetic level. The average level of serum erythropoietin in Sherpas at high altitude was equivalent to that in non-Sherpas at much lower elevation, strongly suggesting that EPAS1 is under selection for adaptation to high-altitude life. They don't overproduce red blood cells the way lowlanders do, which means they avoid the thickened, clotty blood that makes the death zone so dangerous for everyone else. They're running on different hardware. And here's one more thing that doesn't get talked about enough. The damage from the death zone doesn't always stay on the mountain. A large prospective study found that attention, verbal ability, and executive function declined in climbers exposed to severe hypobaric hypoxia, and that cognitive decline persisted even after descent, with older climbers showing greater lasting damage. You can come home from Everest and leave part of your brain up there. Research has found a correlation between hypoxia, altered psychomotor responses, and changes in brainwave rhythms that affect spatial attention and memory. The hippocampus, the cortex, the striatum, the regions responsible for forming memories and coordinating movement, take the hardest hits, which is why climbers so often can't recall summit details clearly, and why their legs stop cooperating before their lungs do. So here's where we started. The death zone kills you from the inside, quietly, and the cruelest part is that your brain is the first thing to go and the last thing to admit it. Your judgment collapses before your body does. Your brain swells trying to save itself. It invents companions to keep you moving. Your muscles dissolve. Your lungs fill with fluid. And some of the damage you carry home. But the thing that should genuinely change how you see all of this, the thing I promised at the beginning, is that the death zone isn't a hard biological ceiling. It's a ceiling for a body that wasn't built for it. Fetuses live there. Sherpas thrive there. Evolution found a way. Which means the death zone is less a limit of human life and more a limit of human life as most of us have it. If this kind of stuff genuinely gets your brain going, drop a comment below. I want to know which part hit you hardest. Was it the hallucinations, the fetal oxygen angle, or the fact that the brain damage can outlast the summit? And if you want to go deeper on what extreme environments do to human physiology, the next video is right there. It's worth your time.